The energy and excitement of her newfound love could not let her sleep much that night. Long before her usual time of waking up, she woke and began to sweep her father's compound. When she was done, she washed the earthen pots and plates used the previous night to eat and went down to the stream to fetch water. All that while she had a song in her heart and a skip in her stride. She felt like the eagle gliding through the sky. She prayed under her breath to the gods she had spoken to some hours earlier, that by the time she had reached home from the river, her parents must have woken up so she could tell them about her love for Obinze. The concept of love was new to her. It made her want to walk in the air and fly without wings. It was one thing she never felt as a princess of the gods. If mortals have this to enjoy, then it must be beautiful being mortal, she thought. Thankfully, by the time she returned from the river, her parents were already awake. Her mother had begun to simmer her soup and some fufu, which they couldn't consume the previous night. When Mbankwo lifted her face to respond to her daughter's greeting, she saw a glow in her face. She had to ask, "Is that you, Urenma?" "Yes, Mama, it is I." "Oh my God, you look like a child of the gods. What did you see at the river this early morning?" Okiki, who was in one corner of his compound cleaning his mouth with a long chewing stick, had also seen his daughter's face glowing like the moon. At first he had mistaken her for an ancestral spirit, but when Urenma spoke, he realized she was his daughter, so he came over to know the reason for the radiant look on her face. "I actually mistook you for a spirit from my ancestors. How were you able to hang the glow of the moon on your face?" "Papa, it is the joy in my heart you see on my face." Urenma set down her water pot and waved at her parents to sit close to her. They all sat on a raffia bench called Munkpoko. Then Urenma let them in on the reason for her joyous mood and her radiant face. "Papa and Mama, I have found love." She waited for them to take in the full weight of her words. She could see from their eyes that they wanted to hear more, so she continued, "The man who has found favor in my eyes is Obinze Maduako. Amadioha, Obihu, the boy whom you speak of is the poorest young man in Uke and all the villages around us. Why choose him as your lover? Or don't you intend to marry him?" asked Ungbanko. "Mama, relax. You and Papa shouldn't worry about his poverty. A man's fortunes can change, can't they? Have you two forgotten how poor you were before I was born? You have told me the story several times, Papa. Look at you now. Aren't you the envy of Uke? I want you two to note my words this morning. Have I spoken anything and it failed to be fulfilled?" "No, you have not, Urenma," responded her parents. "Now hear this, that wretched orphan who has no one but his old dying grandmother shall in 1 year time become the richest man in Uke and all the land surrounding us. I have seen it, and not only that, from today his fame shall begin to spread across our land and beyond. Has any of you heard of a wrestler breaking the bones of other wrestlers?" "No, Urenma. The gods protect them during wrestling matches," replied Okiki. "Well, Papa, today you will hear of a wrestler breaking the bones of fellow wrestlers, and that will be Obinze." Urenma. Obinze is not a wrestler and has not wrestled before. How then could he become a bone-breaking wrestler in his first attempt?" asked Mbankwo. "Well, Mama, I have seen it. It will happen this evening at the village square. I want the two of you to come and watch him. He will make the legendary Ojadili to look like a beginner." Okiki and Mbankwo had seen a lot about their daughter to know that her words never fail. There was no basis to argue with her, so they accepted all she said and asked her to bring Obins home after the wrestling festival to share a meal with them. By evening, the village square in Uke was filled with people from far and near. The village troupe danced to ebullient drumming by young drummers. There was fanfare and boasting as each clan in Uke boasted that they would win the wrestling championship. Except a few young men who Urenma rebuked at the river and the chief priest, no one else knew Obinze was going to take part in that year's wrestling championship and that he was coming to take revenge for all the ridicule he and his clan had suffered. Every year his clan had managed to send 3 wrestlers who always were beaten at the early stages of the wrestling competition. While the people waited for all the wrestlers to arrive, they were entertained by dance groups and masquerades. Obinze was the last wrestler to arrive at the village square. When he showed up, he was dressed in costly apparel and had Urenma by his side holding his hand and occasionally brushing her cheek against his. There was a hush at square. One could have heard a pin drop. The drummers stopped beating the drums and the dancers missed their steps, as all eyes were fixed on Obinze matching into the square with Urenma. He led Urenma to the corner where his clan took their position and announced that he had come to wrestle. His clan brothers were shocked. None amongst them had seen him neither practice nor wrestle before, but with Urenma by his side they could not deny him. Her beauty was such that men acted cowardly before her presence. He was asked at what time he would like to enter the wrestling. He replied, "From the beginning." With his entrance and the amazement that followed it, the drumming and dancing came to an end. The elders who were preside over the wrestling competition took the center stage and announced to all present and the wrestlers that the competition had begun. They announced the rules of the competition and invited the clans who were to do the first round of wrestling. When it was time for the Umu Ume clan to wrestle, Obinze stepped into the center square and the crowd booed. Then his opponent was called out and he ran into the square and began to gyrate and the crowd cheered him on. When the referee signaled that the wrestling had begun, Obinze's opponent ran toward him to sweep him off his feet. Obinze grabbed him with his left arm and swung him around in the air like a rag and then flung him to the ground like a log of wood. The painful cry of the young man hushed the crowd. His thigh bones had been fractured by the impact of his body on the ground. He couldn't stand up. His cry sent attendants into the square. When they found out he had broken bones, they put him on an enkpoko and bore him to a native orthopedist. The crowd, his fellow wrestlers and the elders were all shocked to see a wrestler break another wrestler's bones. It had not been heard or seen in Yucca for many decades. There was no one alive in the land to testify of having seen that at any time. Meanwhile, Obinze took his position for another round of wrestling match with a new opponent. His new opponent took to the wrestling ground with some pomp and pageantry, having made a name for himself the previous year in the competition. The crowd roared and cheered as he pumped his fist into the air and beat his chest with pride and zest. Obinze didn't take any interest in his opponent's ostentatious bravado. He just waited for the fight to begin. When the signal came, he didn't run towards his opponent to bring him down. He waited for him to come for him. The young wrestler disdainfully sized up Obinze and spit in his direction before saying to him, "I will break your neck for what you did to my colleague, you little dog. I hope you cooked for your grandmother because when I break your neck, there will be no one to prepare her food." Obinze didn't reply him. He stood with his gaze fixed on his opponent. The young wrestler ran toward Obinze, his feet pounding the ground like an elephant and his eyes red-shot. Obinze still didn't move. He waited for the perfect moment to act. The wrestler stretched his hands out to grab Obinze, and Obinze skipped to his right side and landed a deafening slap to his face. The young wrestler staggered and turned to face Obinze in anger. His lips were bleeding and the crowd was laughing at him. He felt a ringing sound in his left ear. To save face, he threw himself at Obinze, hoping to grab him and break him into two pieces. Obinze swiftly avoided him and grabbed him by the waist. Lifting him very high, Obinze slammed him on the ground 1, 2, 3 times and steadied him to his feet with his left hand, and then crashed a monster slap into his face and released his hold on his opponent, who fell to the ground. Obinze picked up his opponent and slammed him once more on the ground. The wrestler's neck shifted. He broke bones in his arms and left leg. On the ground, he could hardly scream loud enough. By this time, the crowd was in awe of Obinze. Obinze's kinsmen began to scream his name insanely, and the crowd joined them. Though it was time for Obinze to make way for others' clans to fight, he felt reluctant to leave. The crowd was shouting his name, and it had gotten into his head. He fought hard to keep himself from crying openly. All his life he had been an object of ridicule, and for once in his life, his people and visitors to Uka were singing his name in praise. He stood his ground to take it all in, while the elders waited for him to leave the wrestling ground. A jealous, fearsome wrestler who felt Obinze was beginning to take the shine off him, and the more established wrestlers ran into the wrestling ground and scooped sand from the ground and held it in front of Obinze. That gesture meant he was challenging Obinze to a wrestling match. The crowd was afraid. They knew Ikiagu was a dangerous wrestler. In 4 different occasions he had won the wrestling championship. He always fought like a beast. Most people in the crowd didn't want Obinze to accept his challenge. They were beginning to like him and didn't want him out of the competition at the early stage. Urenma's parents prayed under their breath for Obinze to ignore him and walk away. However, what the crowd didn't know, Ikiagu had picked the wrong time to challenge Obinze. He would live to rue his judgment. Obinze stepped forward and knocked off the sand in Ikiagu's hand and stepped back. The crowd echoed the names of their gods in fear. Some could be seen holding their breath in fear that Ikiagu was going to destroy Obinze. Ikiagu shouted like an animal and leapt forward like a cat. Unlike how he acted in his previous fights, Obinze lunged forward, grabbed Ikiagu midair and suspended him high above himself, and then slammed him on the ground with the agility of a lion and sat upon him and began to land punches on his face. After a few rounds of punches which had disfigured Ikiagu's face, Obinze stood up and lifted him up for a second and crashed him on the ground and walked away. Ikiagu's jawbones were broken, his neck broken, and his waist broken. Obinze also knocked off several of his teeth and tore his forehead and ears open with his punches. Then crowd was in absolute shock of what they had witnessed. It wasn't even a fight, it was an assault. Obinze had simply beaten up the feared Ikiagu like a child. As Obinze walked away, he had no smile on his face. His eyes seemed locked on events or perhaps thoughts far removed from the happenings at the village square. It was clear to all present that a new wrestling beast had been discovered on the wrestling sand of Uke land. Though there were many other wrestling matches that day, the one which dominated chatter till the next day was how Obinze beat Ikiagu up like a little boy. That night, Obinze spent a lot of time with Urenma in her father's compound, chatting about the wrestling, and also the news of their love which had transformed Obinze into a village celebrity. He had not only shown them what he could do in the wrestling ground, he had also won the heart of the most beautiful woman in Uke and all the lands around it. Urenma laid her head on Obinze's laps as he told her several stories about his suffering from childhood and about the tortoise and his wife Aliyah. The parts where Obinze told her about the pains he had been through from childhood made her cry. But the stories about the tortoise and his wife Aliyah left her doubling over with laughter. That night they probably kissed each other 100 times and still couldn't get enough of each other. However, each time Obinze broached on his fantasies about living together with a woman of his love, Urenma would wince and shed a few tears. When Obinze asked her why she cried, she would tell him that her tears were tears of joy. She lied and Obinze didn't know it. The truth was that she would never get to marry any man. As a princess of the gods, she was forbidden to marry any mortal man, and she had only a short life to live amongst men, and it broke her heart. By the next day, the village square was filled with greater number of people who had heard about Obinze's prowess on the wrestling ground. Young and elderly women sung new songs in praise to Obinze. Even his aged grandmother was carried out by her kinsmen to the square to watch her grandson break more bones. The people of Uke could not understand how Obinze was able to break the bones of his fellow wrestlers. No one had been able to do that in decades. The gods had been able to protect them during the wrestling festival. There were a few wrestlers who by night went to seek the oracles to find out the source of Obinze's strength and to acquire charms to subdue him. The Medinse men they approached revealed to them that the source of his strength was the love of a woman and gave them charms to subdue Obinze on the wrestling ground. However, the Medinse men did not know, and neither was it revealed to them that Urenma was a goddess, a princess of the river kingdom. In the village square that evening, the men who had gone to acquire power to subdue Obinze arrived with overwhelming confidence that they would disgrace him. The men were Ikemefuna, Ezenwa, and Uzokwe. The three of them were from different clans, and Ikemefuna was the reigning champion. When Ikoro wooden gong was sounded, they were the first to jump into the wrestling ground and began to dance. Though the wrestling matches were planned in such a way that the last two standing clans would slug it out in a final wrestling match, wrestlers were permitted to challenge other wrestlers for bragging nights. After some clans had wrestled each other that evening, Ikemefuna, Ezenwa and Uzokwe made their way to the wrestling ground, and each of them openly challenged Obinze, who all that evening had not wrestled. Obinze and Urenma were in a corner of the village square watching the wrestling. When Ikemefuna, Ezenwa and Uzokwe challenged Obinze to wrestle each one of them in separate matches that evening, Obinze stood and met them on the wrestling ground and humbly declined the challenge. The crowd was not happy. He had become their favorite wrestler, and they wanted him to teach each one of the three wrestlers a new lesson in wrestling. The three men booed and mocked that he was afraid and that his success the previous day was circumstantial. Obinze ignored them and walked back to sit with Urenma. When he sat down beside her, Urenma whispered, "Obim, each one of them had gone to get charm to fight you, but I want you to accept their challenge. This day Uke will know that there is no charm strong than a woman's love. Obim, go back to the wrestling ground and challenge them to fight you at the same time. I want you to break their bones and knock off their teeth. Will you do that for me?" "I will, Urenma." Obinze stood up and began to run to the wrestling ground. By then an elder was announcing next rounds of wrestling matches to take place. When the crowd saw Obinze running the wrestling ground, it roared and some young men began to hail him, "Ebubi Dikea, Ebubi Dikea, Obinze Ebubi Dikea." Men and women and children took up the chant from those young men and began to sing along with them. Obinze scooped up sand from the ground, held it out and shouted, "Ikemefuna, Ezenwa, Uzokwe. I will wrestle the three of you on the condition that the three of you accept to fight me at the same time." There was silence when the crowd heard Obinze's words. They thought he had gone mad or perhaps had allowed his little success to get into his head. How could he, a beginner in wrestling, challenge three ace wrestlers to fight him at the same time? Ikemefuna, Ezenwa and Uzokwe also wondered if Obinze had gone mad. They queried, "Obinze, do you know what you have just asked for? If I am mad or unaware of the gravity of my challenge, why don't you accept first and find out for yourselves?" Ikemefuna, Ezenwa and Uzokwe ran towards Obinze and knocked away the sand which held out before him. The elderly man who was announcing matches left the ground and the wrestling gong began to sound.